Okay, great. So today's lesson is about bioethics. And today's date is October 21st, 2020. It is Unit 6, Day 3. The objective of today's lesson is biologists will be able to explain various applications of biotechnology by participating in the practice and discussion, and we'll evaluate some of the ethical issues surrounding DNA. So some of these ethical issues came up yesterday, but certainly we know that there are quite a few others.
We're not going to see any more disturbing images today, are we?
I don't believe so.
Okay, because if we are, I'm just going to have to open up a new tab and wait till all the images are gone.
Okay, that's fine. All right, so hopefully you have written down the lesson title, today's date, and you are ready to start taking some notes. We don't have many notes to take today. This is really going to be more of an interesting participatory conversation. But we do need to know what bioethics are. So if any of you are interested in philosophy, then this might be something that piques your interest. Bioethics is the study of ethical issues emerging from advances in biotechnology and medicine. So bioethics gets at the question, now that we know we can do something, should we do it? And there's a difference between those two things. Just because technology has allowed us to be able to do something, that does not necessarily mean we should do it. And so for those of you who might be interested in philosophy, there are so many questions as it relates to bioethics about personal liberty, about trying to interpret the feelings of others, about there's when you become a doctor, you take what's called the Hippocratic Oath, and that means that you swear to first do no harm. So the idea of bioethics in some people's cases might be, well, I might not be doing harm, but is it the right thing to do?
Mr. Red?
Yes.
Does this go like with, like say, I don't know, maybe scientists have figured out a way, but if scientists have figured out a way to like control the weather and change it and stuff like that, does that raise an issue as well?
That would certainly be an issue, but unfortunately we do not have that ability, so that's not yet a question that has been asked.
I'm sorry about my little brother. He's trying to join the conversation.
That's okay. And we know that, as Ayana talks about, one of the biggest issues with bioethics is that we allow a small group of individuals, potentially just a group of scientists, people who have not been democratically elected, people who really owe nothing to society at large. We allow that small group of individuals to make decisions that affect the entire society. So this is also potentially problematic. All right. So bioethics is concerned with quite a few things, with a number of things. But one thing that it is concerned with is euthanasia. So let's look at this video.
A 17-year-old has become the first minor to die by euthanasia in Belgium. It's the first application of legislation adopted by the country in 2014. It allows for the doctor-assisted death of minors of all ages if their condition is incurable. The patient is said to have been critically ill, but no other information has been given. Firstly, happily, there are not a lot of minors in a terminally ill condition, he says. Secondly, doctors use a recognized method in that they put the patient into an artificial coma in the end, what we call palliative sedation. Belgium legalized euthanasia in 2002. 2 years ago, it amended the rules to permit doctor-assisted death for minors of all ages, the first country in the world to do so. In the Netherlands, it's possible for children aged 12 and older.
Het feit dat we daar de mogelijkheid toe gecreëerd hebben.
The fact that we made this possible means a lot of people who are faced with a terminal condition have found peace of mind because they know they can ask for euthanasia. They might decide not to ask the question, but the fact that they can makes a huge difference for a lot of people.
Kan doen, maakt eigenlijk voor heel veel mensen een groot verschil.
Records from Belgium's National Euthanasia Control Committee show that between 2003 and 2013, 8,752 people ended their lives by euthanasia.
So, can someone just briefly describe or define euthanasia? What is euthanasia for those who may not have caught it in the video?
Isn't it like when you kill somebody humanely?
Okay, good. Yeah, it's essentially, another phrase that they did use in the video is doctor-assisted suicide. So I like that Gabby has used the word humanely because that is really what advocates of this practice think about, that this is the humane way to allow someone to make a choice about whether or not they want to live potentially the rest of their life in pain, or if they would prefer to, if their condition is so bad and is incurable, if they would prefer to just, end their life with the help of, a doctor and with the help of chemicals. Okay, so why do you all think this would be controversial? Why is this something that bioethics is concerned with?
Can I talk?
Yes.
Maybe they feel like some people feel like people shouldn't give medicine. Doctors shouldn't be, doctors shouldn't be giving medicine to people to end their lives.
Okay. So some people, again, I talked about the Hippocratic Oath. So some people, will mention that doctors first have an obligation to do no harm. And so some people might argue that literally providing someone with the tool that they need to end their life is the definition of harm. So that's definitely controversial. What else? What other thoughts do we have on this specific phenomenon? Why else might it be controversial? Why might some people be arguing for its use? Sounded like someone was getting ready to say something. Go ahead.
It makes it so people want to suffer.
Okay, exactly. So a lot of people argue that this is, as Gabby said, the most humane way to allow someone to die rather than making them suffer. This gives them an easier, a physically easier way to alleviate that pain. There are so many other considerations here as well. And as they talked about, this practice has been legal in Belgium since 2002. So for almost 20 years, longer than almost all of you have been alive. And it's legal in many other European countries as well, but here in the United States, it's not legal. Can anybody think about a reason why that might be? Why do we think it could be illegal here in the or it is illegal here in the United States?
I think that it could be illegal. It's just a thought, but people, can you be quiet? People, I'm sorry. People might take advantage of what they have, or what they get, and they might, like, I don't know. They might.
What do you mean? What do you mean take advantage?
Like, if they're given the medication, they could. I don't know. Maybe force the medication on others as well.
Okay.
And it could get out of hand.
Okay, so in a worst case scenario, we do know that there are potentially some doctors who, might use their access to these medications, these chemicals, and give them to other people who maybe are, they may be clinically depressed, but they don't have any physical ailments that are, so life-threatening and incurable as to warrant assisted suicide. So that would certainly be a problem, and it could be a slippery slope. If you allow it to be used in certain circumstances, then it might be difficult to create policies to say, well, you can use it then, but you can't use it in that case. You can use it in the case of someone who has terminal cancer, but you can't use it in the case of someone who has, some type of brain injury. Right, so it's a slippery slope. If you allow it for some cases, then you might end up having to allow it for many cases. That's a good point, Ayana. I also want to call your attention to, again, the money. We talked a little bit about money yesterday as it related to agriculture, but how many of you know that there's such a thing as life insurance? And so people can purchase life insurance, which will provide some type of payout to their loved ones or whoever they determine while they're still alive once they die. So depending on the price of the policy, you might get anywhere between $10,000 or $1 million upon your death. But only certain types of deaths are covered, and suicide is not one of them. So if someone dies by suicide, then their loved ones, regardless of how much they've paid into this life insurance policy, their loved ones are not entitled to any of that money. So this opens up a whole other question in terms of the insurance industry. Do we allow people who have chosen euthanasia to still be covered by our life insurance policies? The answer could very well be no, which would be, kind of problematic. Someone might choose to continue to live their life in a very painful state just so that their family can be provided for when they do finally pass on. So that's also a problem. So these bioethics, again, ask many, many questions. There are many sides of these arguments, people who argue for it for some reasons, people who argue against it for others. Let's think about this as well. Designer babies. So we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and this is directly related to DNA. But we are now at the point where this technology, these medicines, do actually exist. We've scientifically advanced to the point where we can now change, as we talked about yesterday, we can genetically engineer babies to have certain traits or to not have certain traits. We can help them, avoid the likelihood of developing diseases. We can lower their risk of developing Alzheimer's and stroke. In theory, it hasn't been done yet because this is an ethical issue, but in theory, we could enhance their athletic abilities. We could enhance their intellectual abilities. And so these are very, very, very sticky subjects. And let's look at this video. Is there a question?
No, more like a comment.
Okay. Can you wait until after this video?
Yeah, I can't wait.
Okay.
Have you ever dreamt of having awesome superhuman powers like the X-Men?
With recent improvements in gene therapy, the reality of having designer babies is closer than ever. But this begs the question, if you were having a child, would you want to pick and choose their traits? Is this even ethical? And how far can the use of these technologies actually go? Remember, we post new content every single week, so subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you don't miss out. Now, back to the video. The phrase designer baby refers to one whose genetic makeup has been altered or chosen to provide the desired genome. There are currently 3 technologies that have been developed to enable this, all of which involve manipulating fertilized eggs before in vitro fertilization. The first one is called Preimplantation genetic diagnosis. This is the simplest of the 3 methods and doesn't involve any gene editing. Instead, it involves choosing between viable eggs for the one that best satisfies what the parents want. For example, it can be used to screen for diseases or even to predetermine gender. The second one is TALENs, transcription activator-like effector nucleases. These are enzymes that can be designed to remove specific parts of the DNA strands. They then replace the section, thus allowing edits to be made. In theory, this technique can be used to target any section of DNA and has been used to design plants, fuels, and even pets to certain specifications. The third one is CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, and it's the process that was discovered in the DNA sequence of certain bacteria. Their DNA contains snippets of the DNA of viruses that have previously attacked them to allow them to recognize any threat in the future. The method by which this new DNA becomes a part of their own has been replicated to allow the modification of other DNA strands. This again, in theory, allows edits to be made to any part of the genome. So can these methods be used on humans? Of these 3, only the use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is already being used for human pregnancies, with the first known case being as early as 1988. There remains a long way to go before the other 2 methods are deemed safe enough for human use. And as far as we know, there have not yet been any uses on a human embryo. Despite only one of these methods being currently used, there are a number of options that are available to parents. Eggs can be screened for gender, appearance, intelligence, disease, and personality. Of these, the most common type of screening is for diseases, particularly for couples who are at high risk of passing them on to their offspring. Screening for other aspects remain highly controversial and in most countries illegal. Crucially, this technique doesn't allow the editing of the genome, but the ability to choose between already viable eggs and decide which one to proceed with during pregnancy. Another emerging technology is that of 3-person babies. This is a procedure that means a baby has 3 genetic parents, with the third person providing the mitochondrial DNA. This can prevent the development of issues such as muscular dystrophy and certain heart and liver conditions. So, what are the future possibilities for designer babies? As scientists perfect techniques of genetic manipulation, especially those of TALENs and CRISPR, the possibilities that become unlocked are theoretically endless. It would become possible to design every part of the genome, whether it's eye color, hair color, disease resistance, or far more advanced traits. What if you could increase brain function, muscle mass, or eyesight? Lifespans could be lengthened, or perhaps new human abilities could be developed. So much so that creating real-life X-Men could come within the realm of possibility. But we have to wonder, how will this change society? While regulations prohibit these types of changes, the technology will become so prevalent that more complex designer babies are sure to happen at some point. There are clear benefits to this. It would reduce genetic and inherited diseases or conditions. The child would have a better chance to succeed in life. Lifespans would increase, and children could be given genes that their parents don't possess. But a number of negatives are associated with this as well. There would be an increased number of terminated embryos, which many believe already constitute as living beings. There could be damage to the overall gene pool. Children would have no choice on how their genes were altered, and there would be a loss of individuality as everyone became more like a generic ideal. Furthermore, some genes could have multiple purposes, and if changed, could have wildly unpredictable consequences, and it could lead to the development of new diseases and vulnerabilities. The main ethical issues about gene modification is the question of who determines which traits are good or bad. We risk eliminating unique and different people from society, and that is a problem. The process of designing a baby would also be incredibly expensive, at least in the beginning. This means that it would be something only accessible to the rich, and lead to further inequalities in society. The ability to create designer babies is far closer than we might think, and in some cases is already taking place. While it seems like there are many benefits to procedures like this, our desire to control every aspect of nature could potentially lead to our downfall. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up and let us know what you think.
Okay. Oops. So what do you all think? They made a case. They made two cases there. There were positives and negatives that were outlined. And before you all share your thoughts, take this question off the screen. We should be aware of the history of this practice as it relates to something called eugenics. So EU, we've talked about that before. We talked about it as it relates to eukaryotes. But EU is a prefix. Perhaps you've heard it in the word euphemism. EU means good. So eugenics means good genes. It's the study of trying to improve the genetic composition of the human race. Now, this is considered a pseudoscience at this point, meaning it's a fake science, and it's highly discredited because it is considered extremely racist. The people who practiced eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th century went on to become Nazis, went on to become white segregationists, and they had this overall theory that, you know, people of an Aryan or people of a Caucasian background were of more pure and supreme genes, or a supreme genetic makeup. And so they believed that in order for the human race to take its next step towards overall development, that those people, the white people, should be the only ones who should be reproducing and having children. That way we could get rid of, quote unquote, the bad genes that were present in people of African descent, people of Asian descent, people of, indigenous American descent. So this is something that is now considered very racist, was considered very racist by many people at the time when these theories were first coming to be. But this in some ways conjures up thoughts of what we just talked about with designer babies, because they did mention in the video that this process of choosing, tailoring the specific genetic makeup of your offspring would be extremely expensive. And so, at least in the beginning, it would be only available to the wealthiest in our society, which then, of course, would, further many of the inequalities that we already have, without this ability. So, what do you all think? There are some goods, there are some positives. We can have babies who do not have genetic disorders. We can have babies who, are more likely to develop specific physical traits. But we also outlined some of the negatives. So what are your thoughts?
Can I go first?
Go ahead.
So the first thing that came into my mind was even though there are some really good benefits, I don't think we should genetically modify the offspring, because a lot of people, they want their child to look a certain way, act a certain way, and have certain traits. And if this was able, to be used everywhere, I'm pretty sure the people that could, they would use it to mostly not help with diseases and stuff. They would use it to make their own preference of their child, what they think their child should look like, act like, and be like.
Okay, definitely solid points there. Thank you, Ayana. Anybody else have any other thoughts?
Honestly, if you got the money and you want to, go for it. Like, sure, yeah, I mean, I want like a child that's good at sports and stuff.
Okay, now let's also keep in mind, we talked about this before, Joseph, but let's keep in mind that there's always going to be this interplay between the environment and your genes. So just because you are, I'm sure we all know people who are 6'3" who can't play basketball. We all know people who are extremely muscular who have zero coordination. So there are so many different attributes that go into being a great athlete that it wouldn't necessarily be a guarantee that a child would be just because they have large hands or a long wingspan. What are your thoughts about that, Joseph?
Oh yeah, that is true though. All right, so maybe I take that back. But like, if you want like a kid that has your type of eyes or something, or you want a kid that has your type of hair, then like really ain't no problem with it. Like,
Okay.
Just like don't be changing like serious type of stuff.
Okay. Anybody else want to respond to that or make another point?
I personally think that it should be used, but only if they put up strict laws to only use it for diseases. Because
Okay.
if they start using it for genes, like changing like the physical appearance of somebody, then that could create like racial like problems and stuff.
Okay. Great point. And what Alicia is, I think, getting at here is something that they did also mention in the video, which is some of this is already being done, and they talked about that it's been done since the 80s in terms of when we think of in vitro fertilization. Now, some people think that that's wrong. Some people are, for various reasons, against in vitro fertilization. Does everybody know what in vitro fertilization is? Maybe I should.
No, I've never heard of it.
Okay. So in vitro fertilization is, you maybe have heard it in a derogatory sense referred to as test tube babies. And that's a really, mean and wrong thing to say. But this involves taking a woman's egg. Some women, for various reasons, are not able to have naturally progressive births. So they produce eggs in their ovaries, but maybe their fallopian tubes are ineffective. So the egg never gets delivered to the uterus, or perhaps their uterus is, no longer functional. So maybe they need to use a surrogate mother, but they still have their own eggs. So in vitro fertilization involves taking the egg from a woman, fertilizing it with the sperm from her chosen man, and in some cases putting that back into that same woman, but in some other cases putting it into another woman who will then serve as the, for lack of a better term, birth canal for that child. And so in vitro fertilization is somewhat controversial because some people don't believe that that's natural. Some people believe that that's against their religion. Some people believe that we should not allow for surrogate mothers, for women who basically just carry the child, but they don't actually, they're not related to the child that they're carrying, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon. But this has been common practice. It's inexpensive and it can be difficult. So science has not developed to the point where this is foolproof or perfect, but this has been done for the last almost 40 years now. And so what this has allowed people to do is say, if a woman, has 10 eggs available, they can genetically analyze each of those eggs and say, these 3 eggs are going to be boys, these 7 eggs are going to be girls. 2 of those boy eggs have a chance at developing some type of genetic disorder. but it's not a high chance, but they do have a chance. The other boy egg has a chance of developing these other disorders. Not a high chance, but it's still a chance, right? So the mother can go in and look and say, well, I know that I want a girl, but I also don't want my child to have this disorder. And so it allows for some aspect of picking. Now, as Alicia said, there need to be laws to say that you can pick certain things, but you can't pick the hair color. You can't pick the height. You can't pick, some things that we shouldn't be so selective about. And this is what bioethics concerns itself with. But certainly there are benefits, and I think Joseph spoke to them. I think Alicia spoke to them as well. I think we would all agree that, it's in the best interest of everyone, of the parents, of the child, and of society to have children who are not sick or who are not plagued by, congenital disorders. So certainly there are benefits, but there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the problem is that many of these conversations are not being had with the public. It's just a small group of scientists and maybe a small group of policymakers who are discussing these questions. But for the most part, regular people like you and I are not thinking about these things as often as we maybe should be. Okay, let's look at another example.
Of doing cloning of monkey and use monkeys as experimental animals is really for the human health, for the curing of human disease. There are many other animal models you can use. You can use mice, and that was widely used, but there has been difficulty in using that as animal model for human disease because mice are very far away from humans.
Okay. So anybody have any thoughts about cloning, human cloning?
Sorry, I know this isn't exactly being serious, but if they had human cloning, I would be the first to sign up so somebody could go to school for me and I could just lay down all day.
That's a good, I think we all wish we could be at two places or in two places at once. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be, as I don't know how old you are, Ayana, but this would be something that only would apply to babies pre-fertilization. So, yeah, this wouldn't be like you step into a chamber, 30 minutes later, out comes you, two versions of you. This would be, this would be essentially kind of like producing twins, but instead of being 99.99% similar, they are, aside from maybe a mutation here and there, they have literally the exact same genome. So, again, many of the people who are against this kind of come at this from a perspective of humans are playing the role of God. and we're starting to get to the point where, you know, we have capabilities that we were never meant to have. That's coming from a, you know, religious and spiritual perspective. But maybe those people have a point. Does anybody agree or disagree?
I disagree. I think you should not be able to clone other things like animals or humans. So I disagree.
Okay. Thank you for that, Kiki. Anyone else? Okay, let's see.
DNA tests like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA are becoming more and more popular. DNA tests like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA are becoming more and more popular. This raises privacy concerns, and not just for those taking the tests. Soon, the concept of privacy as we know it will come to an end. Back in April, police arrested a man as a Golden State Killer, an infamous alleged serial killer who murdered 13 people back in the 1970s and 80s. After all this time, police eventually found the suspect when they uploaded DNA from a crime scene to a genealogy website database, where they found a number of matches, his third and fourth cousins. At first, police didn't release a lot of these details. There was a lot of speculation about how they did find their man. But when I started calling up genealogists, they could guess right away. This is exactly how they have been finding biological parents for adoptees and sperm donor conceived kids for years. Since then, the dam has broken. DNA is being used to solve cold cases and even active investigations. In the last 5 months alone, this technique has contributed to 15 arrests. You might wonder, were these alleged criminals just unlucky? Did they randomly happen to have family members who took a DNA test? The answer is maybe more disconcerting. A study found that most Americans of European descent can already be found through a relative's DNA, just like the Golden State Killer. The relative can be as distant as a third cousin. Third cousins only share a small amount of DNA, but it's enough to build family trees if you use data from the census, obituaries, and other public records. Investigators go through people in the family tree one by one until they get to their suspect. Police do this with a public database called GEDmatch, where anyone can upload results from 23andMe or Ancestry DNA. Even if you never take a DNA test or commit a crime, this can affect you. Criminal cases are one thing, but here's another scenario. A man donated sperm anonymously 30 years ago. If his second cousin once removed takes a DNA test, his children will be able to find him. Relatives you've never met can take DNA tests that affect you, and the actions you take can affect relatives that you don't even know. If you think you've taken precautions to protect your privacy online, you could still find yourself out of luck. As DNA tests get more and more popular, databases like GEDmatch get bigger and bigger. Soon, it won't be hard to imagine a world where anyone can be found, for whatever reason, through a relative's DNA. The idea of your DNA being private no longer exists.
Okay, thoughts on that? Is that unethical? Is that dangerous? Should police departments and investigation agencies like the FBI be able to use data from 23andMe?
No.
Why do you say no, Stephanie?
Because it's wouldn't that be invading our privacy? It's our stuff, you know. ¿Me comprende?
Okay, so the DNA is our stuff, but what they're saying in that video is it doesn't matter if it's your DNA does not even have to be uploaded to these sites. It could simply be a family member, maybe even a family member who you've never even met, don't even know exists, who has, oh, I just want to figure out who my great-great-grandparents are and what I can find out about them. So I'm going to take this DNA test, this ancestry test. And so now their DNA is in this database, has nothing to do with you, but there could still be information found about you based on, the fact that you all share some DNA. It's a tough. That's a tough one. That is a tough one. And again, I tend to see things from. I tend to understand why. I tend to try to understand why things are the way they are. And again, it really comes down to money and profit. So of course, these companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, of course, they would send their data. They will sell their data to police departments because all they're worried about is making money. They don't really have privacy concerns, or they're not concerned with your privacy. All they're concerned about is making more money. So of course they will sell that information to law enforcement agencies. And it also said that there was an article that was referred to in that video that said that individuals of European descent are more likely to be able to be identified. Does anybody think they have a reason why that might be? Why would people of European descent be more likely to be identified using these methods?
Wait, what was your question?
Why would there be? So in the video, there was a brief headline that referred. Let me see if I can just find it.
DNA tests like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA are becoming more and more popular. This guess right away.
So it says most people of European ancestry can be identified from a relative's DNA. Does anybody know why that might be? Or think they know why that might be?
No, not really. At least in my case. I'm trying to think, but I don't really.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for putting on your thinking cap.
What is the question again?
The question is based on this headline that maybe you can see in the bottom right of your screen. It says, most people of European ancestry can be identified from a relative's DNA. And I want to know why you all think that that's true.
I think it's true because, like I said, like if you're a serial killer and you just kill people and you get arrested, they're going, well, if they can't find you and you left like a DNA, like a fingerprint or something, and they try to use it to find you, they can also find your parents, your cousins, your sisters, your brothers. So I think it's kind of true.
Okay. Okay.
Is it because Europeans tend to have more access to their heritage?
That's a big reason why. Yes. So simply the heritage records for Europeans and European Americans are much greater. You know, if we just think about the history of not only our country, but countries around the world, people of color simply have not had the same opportunities to maintain records of their family. You know, most African Americans who can trace their ancestry back into antebellum, so before the Civil War times, when slavery was still legal in the United States, they have to do so by looking at slave records. They literally have to look and see when and where people were bought and sold, and see how their names were changed, and see who owned who. So for the most part, those records, in some cases, were not well kept. But European Americans have much better records because they were citizens, especially land-owning Protestant white males. So it's just much easier because the ability to trace the heritage is much greater. But there's also a scientific reason. So I appreciate you, Alicia. That was basically the answer I was looking for. But the scientific reason is that the further when we think about let me see if I can find a picture. So let's see. So can you all see my screen? Do you see a map?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a lot going on here. And for those of you who might be interested in anthropology or maybe human geography is kind of what we call it in high school, but it's essentially anthropology, then this map should interest you. And if you end up going to college and studying anthropology, you'll look at this map a lot. But this shows the migratory patterns of humans, of different species of humans as well. So you can see in the bottom, we've got three colors here. We've got a red, we've got a darker yellow, and we've got a lighter yellow. The red is Homo sapiens. So this is our species. But there were other species of human as well. So there were Homo neanderthals, and there were Homo erectus. There are a few others. The Denisovans were another species of humans. But the only surviving species of humans today, and for the last 30,000 years or so, have been Homo sapiens. And so Homo sapiens originated based on, and we know this based on fossil records, and we know this also based on DNA evidence, that modern Homo sapiens originated in Eastern and in Southern Africa. So you can trace these arrows to see how over time they move not only throughout the continent of Africa, but across the world. And so we can see that, you know, in what we now know as the United States, humans have only existed here for the last 12,000 years or so, since what we know now as the agricultural revolution. But it's been 200,000 years since humans originated in Africa. And so you can see how they moved first northern Africa into what we would now know as Egypt. Then they moved across the Red Sea into what we now know as Saudi Arabia. A portion of these people went west into the continent of Europe about 40,000 years ago. And then a smaller portion came back and went to the east to what we now know as Asia. We can see that we also have to keep in mind that some of these continents were not located where they are today. So 50,000 years ago, Australia and many of these Indonesian islands would have been much closer together. And in some places, they may have even been touching. So people could have gotten to these places without having to cross vast sections of ocean. So 50,000 years ago, the original inhabitants of Australia reached that continent. But it wasn't until recently, relatively recently, that people made their way to the Americas. So the scientific reason why it's a little bit easier to identify European Americans is because their DNA is much younger than the DNA of people from Africa or people who have African ancestry. Keep in mind that even though people who live in the Americas have only been there for the last 12,000 years or so, many people who live in the Americas also have African ancestry. We don't necessarily think of Latin people or Hispanic people as having African ancestry, but because of the history of the slave trade, many people who live in Brazil, who live in Colombia, Venezuela, even Mexico, Ecuador, El Salvador, Peru, they have African ancestry. And so their DNA is also a bit older than would be the DNA of European people of European descent. And so that just makes it easier because their DNA is more similar to one another. The simple fact that African people who have African descent have such old DNA means that there's a lot of variety in our DNA. It's had a lot more time to develop specific mutations. Whereas people from Europe have been much more clustered. Their DNA is younger. There aren't as many mutations, and therefore it's easier to find similarities between people. So that's the scientific reason. Does that make sense? That was a lot.
What about people in Asia?
And people in Asia, they represent a pretty good middle ground. That's a good question. So we can see 70,000 years ago is a pretty long time ago. We also know that a much lesser known, we often talk about what's called the transatlantic slave trade, which brought African people from the western coast of Africa, for the most part, to the Americas. But there was also a slave trade that sent some African people to India and to Sri Lanka, which is actually not even on this map. But so there are people who live in Southern Asia today who have African ancestry as well. And you might recognize this as seeing some Southern Asian people with much darker skin. But because they represent a pretty strong middle ground 70,000 years ago, they have a good amount of genetic diversity in their population. But if we think about some of the social history, and again, this is no longer even a biological conversation, but if we think about some of the social history of Eastern Asia, specifically China, if you know anything about some of the dynasties that existed there, they were also very clustered. And in the sense that, if you were not from a certain province or if you were not from a certain lineage, then you had fewer opportunities to intermingle and to mate with and have offspring with people from other dynasties or from other provinces. So some of that clustered the DNA in Eastern China, and so you will see less genetic diversity in those populations than you might see in Southern Asia. And again, we also have to think about the legacy we talked about Genghis Khan, I think, at one point several weeks ago, the legacy of his Mongolian empire, which, he had many estimates say hundreds of children. And so one man, ended up totally shifting the genetic destiny of an entire group of people, an entire almost subcontinent of people. So that had huge implications on the genetic diversity as well. So this is interesting. Anthropology is definitely, in fact, for those of you who are kind of like, I like history, but I also like biology, anthropology is a great thing for you to explore. It really takes a look at how human populations came to be, how certain people ended up in certain places. Yeah, I think for many of us, the Hispanic populations are really interesting to look at because they represent, probably more so than any other population on the planet, a sense of intermingling. So you had those indigenous people who were arriving. Let's see if I can find another map. So this one's a little more detailed. So you had certain indigenous populations who were arriving all the way down here in what we now know as Argentina and Uruguay, 12 as recently as 12,000 years ago. But you also, at the same time, then had European settlers who were coming, who were bringing much older DNA, and they, of course, end up intermingling with the indigenous populations. Then they end up bringing people from Africa who had very old DNA. They bring their genetic diversity with them as well, and they intermingle. So the racial social system in the Latin America or in Hispanic America is really quite profound, and it has biological impacts as well. So you'll see people of literally all skin colors and of all hair types and hair textures in Latin America. Many of you maybe have heard of the boxer Canelo Alvarez. He's a Mexican boxer, but he looks like he would be Irish. Let's see, share this tab. So he, this is a Spanish-speaking Mexican man with red hair and white skin. And so this really represents one end of, the fact that he might have a direct link to a European settler, and maybe there was no intermingling in his family. But then you can also look at, let's see if I can find, there's a Brazilian rapper named MV Bill. He looks like he's a West African man, right? So you have this spectrum in Latin America of people who are coming from all these different places. They have different types of genetic diversity. Some people have the indigenous populations. Some people have solely European ancestry. Some people have solely African ancestry, and most people have some mix of all three. So Adrian says his family is 1% Irish. Yeah, and in fact, even more recently, one of the more in the middle of the 20th century, there was a mass migration of Japanese people to Latin America, which is not something that a lot of people talk about, but that introduces a whole other type of genetic diversity to the area. So in terms of what we think about from an anthropological perspective, Latin America represents kind of a case study that no other place in the world does. You can't really go, of course, in Africa, there's a lot of religious diversity, there's linguistic diversity, there's cultural diversity, but genetically, and there's genetic diversity, but you don't see that same amount of intermixing from other places around the world that you do, even in Asia, but definitely not in Latin America. So that's an interest. I'm glad you asked that question. So yes, I took an entire year of courses about this, and it's fascinating stuff. And the way that we're able to study this is all because of DNA. We just literally look at what's called mitochondrial DNA, which is a type of DNA that you get from your mother. And you can go back and you can look at, you can trace generations of mothers using this mitochondrial DNA, and literally find out where mothers are from. So yes, I forgot exactly what it's called, but it's an interesting topic. Do we even have, let's see, it's 10:30. Do I have the assignment on Canvas? I'm not really that excited about the assignment for the day. And this was kind of just an interesting conversation. Are there any other questions or any other points people want to make? I've done a lot of talking.
So everybody's not like, I guess everybody's mixed with different things. Like all human beings are mixed with different things. Like we're not 100% this, 100% that.
Yeah, you'd be very, very hard pressed to find somebody who has almost, I don't want to use the word pure because that sounds kind of questionable, but you'd be hard pressed to find someone who has no type of genetic diversity in their genome. Everybody has some link to some other group of people. Most people do have African some amount of African ancestry, and that's because if we're looking at this map, we can literally see most people came from Eastern and Southern Africa. Even though it may have been 200,000 years ago, it still happened.
So when was the time of Pangea again? Because I know that continents used to be close together, and then as time moved on, it started spreading apart, right?
Yes, that's true.
So
now, if you're talking about Pangea, where it was just one supercontinent, then that would have been millions of years ago. But certainly 200,000 years ago, this would have been before a major ice age. So, today, on a clear day, you can see from Alaska, which is up here, all the way to Russia, which is, across the Bering Strait. But there is still a pretty massive amount of water between the two. But if we go back, to the last ice age, this was a land or an ice bridge that people could literally cross. And so that's how people got from Asia to the Americas. Of course, they didn't build a canoe and, sail across the Pacific Ocean. They went over this ice bridge when everything was frozen over, probably in search of, they may not have realized that, that they were moving as far away from the mainland as they were, but they were entering a new continent, probably in search of warmer climates and of better food.
So is it true that different skin colors were built on where people went, where the people in that time period went?
That is true, yes. The production of melanin in our skin requires energy, and it's an energy that our bodies and our cells are willing to use if we are living in a very sunny, very hot climate, because it protects us from the sun's UV rays, and it allows us to reflect the light, the heat energy, right? Darker colors reflect heat energy, lighter colors absorb it. So if we think about the fact that, modern humans originated in Africa, where there's a lot of sunlight, where it's very hot, there was an advantage to having a lot of melanin in your skin. As these populations moved out of Africa and north into Europe and even east into Asia, there was no longer an advantage provided by having darker skin. In fact, it was a disadvantage because, like I said, producing melanin requires expending energy. And if our cells don't have to use, you guys have probably learned this by now, if our cells do not have to use energy to do something, they won't do it. And they'll save it to use it for something else. So rather than using the energy to make melanin, they saved that energy to do other things, which resulted in people with progressively lighter skin tones.
I thought it was the other way around. Like with darker colors being able to absorb light, and while lighter colors get to reflect light.
You're right. You are right. I did
Well,
say
yeah,
that.
that's what they taught us in science class. In eighth
You are
grade
right.
science, I think.
Wait,
I think so.
let's see, because now I'm confused.
I'm not sure. Okay, you can stop quacking like a duck now.
Okay, black absorbs the most heat. You're right. Okay, good. But yes, Ayana, the geographic location of people did ultimately determine their skin color. And it's 10:35, so I will allow people to go ahead and start dropping off if they have other things to do. But it also is a matter of vitamin deficiency as well. So sunlight is good for vitamin D. Yeah, vitamin D. And so vitamin D provides a benefit to people with darker skin, and vice versa for people with lighter skin.
I don't mean to sound stupid, but people with darker skin can get sunburned as well, right? I know a lot of people that say people with more melanin can't get sunburned.
Yes, it can certainly happen. It just doesn't happen as easily. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. I just want you all to do the exit ticket. You don't need to worry about the other discussion. Just do the exit ticket.
See you tomorrow. We can leave, right?
Yes, you can.